I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes. One more time. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At a Senate Health Committee hearing on Wednesday, Senator Bill Cassidy spoke about school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Republican senator slammed teachers' unions for shutting down schools even after, quote, medical professionals said it was safe to go back. Cassidy spoke about how students have fallen behind during school closures and warned that it could take years to overcome. Take a listen to his remarks here.
Thank you for scheduling this meeting. And we're here to talk about our students and the enormous, unprecedented learning loss crisis, which is a direct result of school closures. And I feel as if I have a kind of personal connection with this. My wife is the chair of a board for a public charter school addressing the needs of those with dyslexia. At the outset of the pandemic, she sent them all home with computers in which they could monitor what they were doing online, and if they didn't have internet at home, a Wi-Fi device by which they could monitor. But they had the school had the ability to check on which kids were using which programs. And they found that those children who were at the highest academic risk, the children from the lowest socioeconomic background, never opened their computer. Makes sense. Mom may have been at work, single family, without supervision, and the child was not able to go online. So this idea that we were going to make things up by doing things remotely turned out to be totally, tragically false. I thank my witnesses for coming to talk about this issue. Keeping schools closed flew in the face of logic, reasoning, science, I say that as a doctor, and evidence. And now children are facing the consequences of bad decisions made by adults, with enormous consequences, knowing that now it may take years to overcome the downwardly adjusted trajectory for some of the students further left behind. Now, by the way, money is not the issue. $190 billion has gone through the door to support K through 12 education, but only 23% has been drawn down. So that's troublesome. And even with the massive influx of cash, we still witnessed widespread school closures months into the pandemic, even after medical professionals said it was safe to go back. Also, despite a federal vaccination distribution plan that prioritized teachers and other school employees. But even as more teachers became vaccinated, the goalpost for reopening schools was constantly moved back. Just this year in January in Chicago, teachers' unions shut down schools for a week for refusing to return to in-person learning. And while the adults bickered, the students fell further behind. They struggled emotionally and mentally, which also affected their grades. And while the evidence was clear that it was, in fact, safe to return to the classroom, teachers' unions forced shutdowns to continue, and in many cases, this was enabled by politicians. We know that it was safe to reopen because others in the United States did reopen, and it was indeed safe. Child care facilities and private schools were able to safely remain open even during the height of the pandemic, when the interest of the student was truly put first, rather than the interest of a union or a politician to pander to the union. A way to reopen was found, and the students got the education and support they needed. As a result of remote learning and shuttered schools, we find ourselves in this current predicament. Scholarly research proves just how detrimental virtual schooling was for students. Keeping schools closed was detrimental for all, but especially for students from a disadvantaged background. While students in high-income schools who had access to resources fell behind academically during remote instruction, their peers at lower-income schools struggled even more. English learners, minority students, students with disabilities, and, at least in the experience of the school my wife is involved with, dyslexic students face the brunt of this. Now, we already have problems with achievement gaps. Imagine a kindergarten student who has dyslexia and has yet to be diagnosed or given specific instructions during this time. The student would surely fall further behind, and the damage done could last for years. The student would have trouble learning to read, which would then make it harder for the student to read to learn in the future. Now these achievement gaps have been exacerbated to an even greater degree. Remote instruction has forced students and parents and families into a crisis which we know could have been avoided. One study out of Sweden, where most primary schools remained open during the duration of the pandemic, showed no general learning loss accrued. Now, I want to make it clear that Sweden's decision was not at the expense of teachers and students' health. Severe cases of COVID-19 in students was very low, despite the decision to keep schools open. GAO, the Government Accounting Office, a nonpartisan entity, found that 85% of teachers reported that any form of live instruction, whether fully or partially in person, was beneficial to their students. Equally as telling, GAO found that 61% of all U.S. teachers had more students experiencing emotional distress than normal during the pandemic, and that's just for the students who remain enrolled. Remote instruction also has led to decreased enrollment across the nation. For instance, most remote districts have lost 8.1% of their kindergarten students. I'll also note that private, parochial, and charter schools were, if allowed, much more likely to remain open, and indeed their attendance increased. Giving parents the power to choose the school that is best for their child was powerfully good for the child. There's a long road ahead. Keeping schools closed has led us directly to this crisis. On top of the learning loss en masse, students have struggled and are struggling with emotional health. It is clear that the decisions made by adults have inflicted tragedy upon an entire cohort of students. Current students will feel the effects and consequences potentially years down the line if we do not work together to turn the tide now. For each year students are behind academically, learning loss compounds and the issue bleeds into subsequent years, with the next year being worse than the last. We owe students more. They deserve better from the adults who made decisions daily about their lives and future livelihoods. I thank you again, witnesses, for testifying today. Your insight is valuable as we reflect on what could have been done better and how we move forward to best serve our nation's students and their families and our collective future. I look forward to your testimony and once more thank the chair.